My name is Maribel Crane. I'm 38, and I've spent the better part of my life keeping broken things alive at Sage Tech, a mid-sized consulting firm that grew into a patchwork software provider during Seattle's dot-com wave. I'm the senior network engineer. Most people upstairs don't know my name. That's the nature of this work when everything runs. You're invisible. When it fails, suddenly you're the only person they remember exists. I sit in the basement literally. Our office used to be warehouse storage, and it still feels like it low ceilings. Concrete floors, flickering fluorescent lights that buzz like insects trapped in glass. The air conditioner wheezes with every cycle against the walls. Ancient server racks hum and rattle like they're muttering secrets in binary. It smells faintly of dust and burnt plastic, a scent that clings to my clothes long after I leave. The team around me is small but sharp in their own ways. Jake, fresh from a coding boot camp, still carries the glow of optimism that 2 years of corporate reality hasn't fully dimmed. He's eager, curious, and constantly chasing solutions faster than his experience allows. Lisa, our database administrator, is the opposite. 8 years here have given her the 1,000-yard stare of someone who has survived too many midnight migrations. She speaks in SQL like it's her first language and somehow coaxes miracles out of machines that should be in a museum. Then there's Alex, the security specialist who left government work for this madhouse, and still hasn't adjusted to the private sector's appetite for risk. Every week he warns of threats we can't afford to ignore, and every week management ignores them anyway. Together, we're the quiet spine of a company built on deferred maintenance and duct tape solutions. Upstairs, they talk about revenue streams and market positioning. Down here, we keep the blood flowing through servers that should have been retired during the Bush administration. The thing is, you don't notice a spine until it breaks. That truth hangs over me every time I log in. Every time I scan error reports no one else bothers to read. I've learned to live with the silence, with the knowledge that my work only matters when everything falls apart. And just a few weeks ago, I decided it was time to ask for something that could keep us from breaking altogether. I'd spent the better part of 3 weeks on the proposal, often staying long after the others had gone home. The basement grew so quiet after 9 that even the hum of the servers felt louder, like a reminder of why I was still at my desk. I wanted the document to be airtight numbers, forecasts, risk assessments, so there would be no excuse to brush it aside. The course I had my eye on was a week-long intensive in cloud infrastructure management. The kind of training that didn't just add another certificate to my wall, but gave us the tools to modernize the fragile systems I babysat every day. The price tag was $8,500 not pocket change, but far less than what we'd lose if the wrong system failed at the wrong time. I backed that number with calculations that could make a finance director nod in approval return on investment charts. Comparisons of SLA penalties if downtime exceeded contracted limits. Estimates of recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives based on our current setup. Every detail carried the same message: we were skating on thin ice, and one wrong move could drown the company. I thought about my mother more than once while I typed. Last month had been her 60th birthday, and instead of flying down to California like I'd promised, I was stuck here on call because a critical database had refused to replicate. I told myself she'd understand she usually did, but guilt doesn't disappear just because someone forgives you. The sacrifices I made for this job had to mean something. If I could prevent the inevitable collapse by fighting for the right training, maybe the missed birthdays and canceled weekends would feel less like wasted time. I polished the proposal until the language was sharp enough to cut through any boardroom fog. No grand metaphors, no flowery pleas, just clean numbers, risk tables, and a timeline that showed exactly how this single investment would protect millions in revenue. For once, I let myself imagine Hammond, our director, reading it and realizing he had underestimated me. I saved the file, printed 2 copies, and slid one into the interoffice envelope marked for his desk upstairs. As I sealed it, I allowed myself a moment of quiet hope that this time, someone would actually see the storm coming before it hit. 2 weeks after I sent the proposal, Hammond's assistant pinged me with a calendar invite. 15 minutes, his office, budget discussion. I walked up from the basement, past the buzzing fluorescents, clutching my copy of the request like a student hoping for a passing grade. Hammond's office was everything the basement wasn't. Floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the parking lot, carpet so plush my shoes sank into it, and a desk so polished it reflected the overhead lights. The walls were a gallery of mediocrity dressed as achievement-framed certificates from weekend MBA programs, leadership seminars with titles like Synergizing Human Capital, and motivational posters that nobody in their right mind believed. One showed a lone mountain climber under the words, persistence. The hard work you do after you're tired of the hard work you already did. The irony would have made me laugh if I wasn't sitting across from the man who controlled our budget. He didn't look up when I came in, just flicked his eyes toward the chair while scrolling on his phone. After a few beats, he set it down and steepled his fingers like he was about to deliver wisdom from on high. Maribel, about your training request, he began, his tone dripping with corporate solemnity. It's not mission critical. The words landed heavier than I expected. He leaned back, smirk tugging at his mouth, as if he'd just solved a puzzle no one else could. Budgets are tight this quarter. We need to focus on essentials only. I'd spent nights quantifying those essentials, translating risk into numbers even an accountant would respect. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice steady. This certification directly reduces our downtime exposure. Without it, our RTO and RPO will slip. He raised a hand, cutting me off mid-sentence. You're smart. You'll figure it out. That's what we pay you for. I pressed my palms against my knees under the desk to keep them from shaking. Explaining further would be like teaching algebra to a brick wall. So I swallowed the heat rising in my chest and simply nodded. Understood. I'll make a note of this conversation in my files. Something flickered across his face at that wariness. Even Hammond knew the power of a paper trail. I walked out of his office without another word, back down to the basement, already drafting the first line of my new incident log. If they wouldn't give me the tools to prevent disaster, I'd at least make sure the record showed exactly who had chosen that path. The weeks after that meeting felt like walking across ice that cracked a little more each day. Our systems had always been temperamental, but now the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Memory leaks appeared in logs like stubborn bruises that wouldn't fade. Connections dropped without warning, only to return as if nothing had happened, leaving us questioning our sanity. The nightly backups failed often enough that I stopped trusting them. When I checked the logs, the errors stared back at me like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. Lisa put it best one evening as we stared at a database that refused to replicate. It's like nursing a terminal patient, she muttered, rubbing her temples. You keep changing the IV, but you know it's only buying time. Her words hung in the fluorescent light, and for once, none of us argued. Alex was harsher. This is security suicide. He snapped during one of our late-night check-ins. You cut corners long enough. And it won't just be downtime, we'll be inviting an attack. His frustration was raw. But what could we do? The warnings went upward, and upward they disappeared. Jake still tried to hold on to optimism, suggesting quick fixes he'd read about on tech forums, but even his energy was wearing thin. I caught him one night staring at the error logs with the blank expression of someone realizing enthusiasm wasn't armor against reality. For me, the inevitability settled deep in my chest. Every flashing alert, every incomplete backup felt like another monitor flatlining in slow motion. I knew the story was already being written, it just hadn't reached its final chapter yet. So I wrote my own version. Each night I updated my logs, layering in timelines, error reports, and incident notes with the precision of an archivist. I wanted a record that no executive could dismiss. A trail so clear it would survive even the most brutal post-mortem. I stored copies on local drives, cloud accounts, even printed some to lock in my desk. If failure was coming and I no longer doubted it was, I refused to let the narrative be twisted afterward. When the blast hit, I wanted history to show exactly who had chosen to save pennies while the foundations cracked beneath us. It was a Tuesday morning, just past coffee number 3, when every screen in front of me erupted in red. The monitoring dashboards screamed like sirens, alerts rolling so fast they blurred together. The database was gone, portals unreachable, internal communications dark. For a moment, I just listened the hum of the servers swallowed by a flood of alarms, and then my fingers started moving on instinct. By 9:47 a.m., Sage Tech wasn't just limping. It was on the floor, unresponsive. Calls flooded in before I could even form a strategy. Sales reps whispered from the break room, too scared to pick up phones while furious clients hammered the lines. One local startup shouted that their payment processor was down and employees couldn't be paid. A logistics firm in Tacoma threatened to switch vendors if we didn't restore their system within the hour. Someone texted me a screenshot of a tweet Seattle Times is covering the Sage Tech outage. What a joke. I tried to triage what I could. Legacy systems, cranky as they were, could be coaxed back to life with enough patience and duct tape fixes. I rerouted, restarted, and managed to revive a few internal tools. But the new cloud-based architecture, that fragile half-step toward modernity, remained a black hole of errors. Its screens were mocking reminders of the certification Hammond had called not critical. The training I'd begged for would have given me the skills to pull us out quickly. Instead, I was improvising in a language I only half spoke. The chaos wasn't confined to my basement. Overhead, footsteps pounded like thunder, doors slammed. A manager shouted so loudly his voice carried through the vents. At lunch, I heard the surreal rumor that executives had to pay cash in the cafeteria because the point-of-sale system had crashed with everything else. I kept my head down, switching between terminals, patching whatever I could. Lisa showed up beside me, hair pulled into a messy knot, silently diving into database triage. Alex fought to hold a line on security, warning that in our desperation we were opening doors that shouldn't be opened. Jake ran between us fetching logs, eyes wide but determined, somewhere above. Hammond was no doubt fielding questions from people with titles that ended in C. Down here, I was living the consequence of his smirk, watching a company's heartbeat stutter without the medicine it needed. By early afternoon, the outage had hardened into full-blown crisis. My screens pulsed with errors. Lisa muttered half-formed SQL commands like prayers, and Jake's sneakers squeaked against the concrete as he rushed between desks. The basement felt like the control room of a sinking ship, frantic, air thick with sweat and burnt plastic. That was when the door slammed open. Hammond stormed in, tie loosened, his face flushed the color of a bad sunburn. The air seemed to contract with him, his panic so raw it radiated. "Maribel," he barked, his voice cutting across the hum of servers. "Why isn't this fixed yet? Do you realize how much money we're losing every hour?" I didn't look up right away. My fingers tapped commands, buying myself a moment. Finally, I swiveled in my chair and met his eyes. Behind him, Alex leaned casually in the doorway, arms crossed, and a few others had drifted into the hall, drawn by the noise. "I'm doing everything I can with the tools available," I said evenly, gesturing toward the wall of red alerts. "That's not good enough," Hammond snapped, voice cracking. "This is your job." I pulled up an email thread on my center screen, enlarging the font so the subject line was impossible to miss. Training Request Cloud Infrastructure Certification. The timestamp glowed like a flare. "This," I said, my tone calm, almost clinical, "is exactly the scenario I outlined here. The certification I requested would have given us the knowledge to restore the cloud systems quickly. You denied it." Hammond froze. The blood drained from his face as he stepped closer, eyes darting to the message on the screen. The silence stretched, broken only by the fans whirring in the racks. In the hallway, I caught Lisa's sharp intake of breath, Jake whispering something under his breath. His mouth opened and closed once, twice, like a fish gasping on a dock. You should be able to handle this without training," I asked, my voice still steady. That was your call, and now we're here. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The paper trail spoke louder than anything I could have shouted. Hammond looked around, suddenly aware of the staff watching, of the weight of his own decision pressing down on him. For the first time since I'd known him, the smirk was gone. The outage stretched on, swallowing the afternoon and bleeding straight into night. The basement turned into a war room lit only by the glow of our monitors. Every time I thought we'd stabilized something, another crisis clawed its way to the surface. The first hit at 4 o'clock our backups. The most recent restore point was corrupted, checksum errors riddling every attempt. Lisa's hands trembled as she typed, muttering that she'd seen this before, years ago, but never this bad. By 6, the failover cluster we tried to lean on refused to start. The licensing expired months earlier when procurement decided renewal was non-essential. By 8, Jake nearly broke. He took a call from a logistics client in Tacoma who screamed about missed deliveries and threatened to file a lawsuit. His face went pale, and he shoved the phone into my hands. I calmed the client as best I could, but the truth was, we had no timeline. At 10, Alex stormed in from an emergency meeting upstairs. They want us to disable authentication protocols so clients can access what's left, he snapped, slamming his notebook on the desk. They're asking me to open the doors to attackers just to avoid headlines. His voice shook with fury, but he wouldn't bend. For once. I was grateful for his stubbornness. By midnight, we almost lost everything. A misconfigured restore script began overwriting live data with incomplete snapshots. I caught it seconds before it buried us. My chest ached with the weight of what nearly happened months of records, gone in one careless overwrite. I fixed it, but the bitter taste lingered. The hours dragged. Lisa fought exhaustion, typing with half-closed eyes. Jake fetched coffee, his panic muted into silent obedience. Alex argued with executives until his voice was raw, then came back down to sit beside me, shoulders heavy, through it all. I kept typing, patching, coaxing, praying. I could patch, yes. I could keep the heart beating with shaky hands and sheer will, but I couldn't cure the disease, not without the training that had been written off as not critical. Around 3 in the morning, I leaned back, staring at the basement's narrow window. Rain streaked down the glass, blurring Seattle's city lights into a smear of silver. My reflection stared back at me tired, determined. For the first time, I saw my own worth with brutal clarity. By the time dawn seeped through the narrow basement windows, the outage had finally bent to our stubborn will. Services limped back online, patched together with compromises and sleepless hands. My eyes burned, my body felt like it had been hollowed out, but at least the building above us wasn't on fire anymore. I hadn't even finished my first cup of bitter break room coffee when Hammond appeared at my desk. He looked wrung out, his shirt untucked, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Without a word, he dropped a stack of forms onto my keyboard. I glanced down training approvals. Not just the certification I'd requested, but 2 additional courses, disaster recovery. Advanced cloud migration, each signed with his tight scrawl. It's essential we move quickly on this, he muttered, his voice thin, as if admitting defeat cost him something physical. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the smell of stale cologne in his wake. I stared at the forms, my chest tightening with something that wasn't victory. The irony cut sharper than any insult. 2 days ago, my request had been dismissed with a smirk. Now, after 18 hours of chaos and millions burned in downtime, suddenly the same training was not just approved, it was mandatory. Not critical Tuesday, essential Thursday. Later that afternoon, HR summoned me upstairs. The woman waiting behind the desk smiled too brightly, like she'd rehearsed her lines. She slid a folder toward me, a retention bonus. Generous on paper, tied neatly to an NDA agreement. The message was clear: stay quiet about the disaster. Take the money. Pretend trust hadn't already been shattered. I closed the folder without touching it. No, I said softly. Not angry, just finished. Her smile faltered, but she didn't push. She simply gathered the papers and thanked me for my time. Back at my desk, I signed the training approvals with a steady hand. Then, without ceremony, I opened a new tab on my browser and updated my resume. I saved the file under a name no one else would notice and slipped my flash drive back into my pocket. The company had finally realized the value of my expertise, but they had taught me something true recognition that comes only after catastrophe isn't worth holding on to. 3 months later, I was no longer walking into a dim basement lined with failing servers. Instead, I swiped my badge at the glass doors of a small startup in downtown Seattle, where sunlight poured through wide windows and whiteboards were filled with questions rather than excuses. The company wasn't large, but it had something Sage Tech never did: leadership that believed people were worth investing in. My new manager, Jennifer, was the kind of leader I'd almost forgotten existed. She read every proposal with care, asked questions that proved she understood the stakes, and treated training as a foundation rather than a luxury. When I requested an advanced course in cloud infrastructure, she didn't smirk. She asked me how I planned to share what I learned with the rest of the team. For the first time in years, I felt like my voice carried forward instead of disappearing into the void. I finally took the courses I'd fought so hard to justify, filling gaps that had haunted me through sleepless nights. Each lecture, each lab, felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that Hammond had dismissed. I grew sharper, steadier, more certain of my craft. The pride wasn't just in what I knew, it was in knowing I worked for a place that saw knowledge as survival, not indulgence. When Jake joined us a few weeks later, fresh from his resignation at Sage Tech, I felt something almost maternal. He was still eager, still learning, and now he had space to thrive. I spent hours mentoring him, walking him through problems without the weight of panic pressing down. Watching him succeed reminded me why I'd chosen this path in the first place. Seattle's tech circles are small, and word travels fast. Over coffee one morning, a colleague mentioned that Sage Tech had suffered another catastrophic outage. This one was worse than the last, longer, deeper, more expensive. The irony was bitter. The training approvals had sat unused because too many experienced staff had already left. I set my cup down and let the news wash over me without triumph or pity. Hammond had nowhere left to hide. But me, I had somewhere better to go. And I had already gone. I walked away whole, carrying only the lessons worth keeping.